If you've been watching my Gen 2 videos for a while now, you might remember the migration guide that I made for using Libressl in Gen 2 and basically migrating your system over to it, compiling all your different packages against it, and then some specific guides for programs like Firefox that needed additional patches in order to work with Libressl. Well, Gen 2 is no longer going to have official support for this Libressl migration. You're going to have to rely on any patches that come through the Libressl overlay in order to get anything working, if you decide to do this in the future. And the maintainers of this overlay, they were already having a difficult enough time last year, around the time that I was making those videos, to try and support applications like Firefox. If you remember, you had to use an older version compared to the latest release of Firefox in order for it to work against Libressl, because Firefox would update so frequently that it wasn't able to be maintained to constantly patch those applications. And the patches required to make applications work with Libressl in general just tend to be very complex, even more so than if you were to compare it to, say, LTO, right? Like another somewhat exotic configuration. The patches needed to get that working are peanuts compared to Libressl. And I guess more people were interested in LTO in general compared to Libressl. But anyway, support for Libressl is dead in Gen 2, so it's basically going to be dead to Gen 2 users. And the same also goes for Void Linux. So this one is probably a little bit more of a bigger deal because Void Linux was that distro that was known for having Libressl by default and for maintaining some of those complex systems of patches that were necessary to keep things going, which, despite all of the hard work that the maintainers of Void Linux put into it, one of the results was that only a handful of packages had official support on that distro, which I guess is fine if you're going to go with a very minimal system anyway, which is probably what people that are trying to install Void Linux are looking for. But obviously, most people in general using Linux are going to want to have access to a variety of packages. So yeah, Void Linux is going to be switching over to OpenSSL by default as well. And this decision actually came from about a year-long discussion that was had on this GitHub page, on the Void Packages page. It was pretty much summed up in this first post here about the pros of using OpenSSL versus Libressl. Obviously, the first one is going to be a lot easier to support, not requiring as many patches for applications and getting newer algorithms added into it faster, versus Libressl just potentially being safer by default. And this probably comes from, well, if you remember the Heartbleed vulnerability from a few years ago, I think it was back in 2014 that was publicly announced, that pretty much every system out there was vulnerable to. And that was due to the fact that virtually everything out there, every application out there is using, or at least every application that uses SSL is using the OpenSSL cryptographic libraries. And this is also the reason why Void Linux originally made that bold decision to switch to using Libressl by default. You can see the date right here, June the 8th of 2014. This is just a few months after the Heartbleed vulnerability was released. And I think their original idea here, well, they pretty much say as much here, was that the more people in the free open source community would follow suit, maybe you would end up seeing more distros and more applications using Libressl by default. Although that didn't really happen, there's really no other, this is Void Linux is pretty much the most well-known distro that had Libressl by default, and even then, many people consider it to be a pretty obscure distro. But yeah, the idea was to have more variety, more variety of SSL being used out there, so that if another Heartbleed bug were to rear its ugly head, everybody's eggs wouldn't be in the same basket like they were before. Well, except for the BSD users, their eggs are in like an adamantium basket that is surrounded by a force field. But as far as Linux is concerned, Libressl is pretty much dead. Those were the two distros that really had documented support for it, and they no longer do. Now, this doesn't mean that Libressl itself is dead, because that was originally an OpenBSD project. So you're still going to see continued development and support over there. But Libressl getting killed off in the Linux world, I don't really think that this is good as far as support for Libressl is concerned, because it's already difficult enough to get application support on Linux. Just, think of all the applications that exist out there for like Windows and Mac, and how few of them are supported on Linux. And this is primarily due to the fact that the developers of these applications don't see it being worth their time to support Linux, just due to its market share. So few people out there, at least as far as desktop users are concerned, are using Linux, and not counting Android, like I'm talking about a Linux desktop, compared to Mac and Windows users. Well, the market share of BSD is even smaller compared to that. Like it's something like 10 or maybe 100 times smaller as far as like desktop BSD users compared to desktop Linux users. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there were more people using Libressl sort of hacked together on Gentoo or Void Linux than there was in all of OpenBSD combined. And those distros, like, again, Gentoo and Void Linux, as far as just Linux goes, are already pretty obscure. But the fact that Libressl isn't really going to be a thing on Linux anymore, it kind of gives me System D vibes. Like, these days, if you want to use OpenRC or run it, you don't really have a lot of options as far as distros to go to. There really aren't. I mean, there pretty much aren't any just works distros that you could just follow a simple GUI to install that come with either of those init systems. You pretty much have to install Slackware or Artix or Gentoo to use an init system other than systemd. Now, I know that init systems and SSL libraries are different. They're probably not as significant, or maybe you think they are more significant. But this just reminded me of that, because it's another area of system customization that has pretty much been eliminated from Linux. And that's one of the primary reasons that I like Linux so much. The whole fact that I can mod it, I can switch out different parts as I see fit. It can be customized however the user wants to match their security preferences or their usability preferences or just their personality. Linux is pretty much like the AR-15 of operating systems. But I think that the main thing that we're all really concerned about this, though, is just the security. Because if another Heartbleed type of bug were to come up in OpenSSL, the scope of the attack, it would be just a little bit broader. Even those Gentoo and Libressl users that migrated from OpenSSL to Libressl and Gentoo, now they are going to be vulnerable as well. So that's another 0.001% attack surface gained. But as usual, the OpenBSD users, they will get to laugh at us in our fortified bunkers. But let me know what you think about this in the comments below. Are you sad that Libressl is dead in Linux? Are you happy? Do you just not care?